22 boys were brought to a pristine wilderness in southeastern Oklahoma. They were the picture-perfect children of 1950s America, 11 years old, white, Protestant, and middle class. Each of them was academically successful, psychologically normal, and from a stable, two-parent home. They did not know each other. They were selected precisely because they were so remarkably well-adjusted. If anything went wrong in this paradise, it could not be blamed on broken homes, disturbed personalities, or pre-existing hatreds. 2 weeks later, this hand-picked group of normal children was at war. They were burning each other's flags. They were ransacking cabins, flipping beds, and hoarding stolen property. They refused to eat in the same room. When forced together, they hurled food and venomous insults, their faces twisted with a genuine, terrifying rage. Fights became so violent that adults had to physically separate them to prevent serious bloodshed. This is the Robbers Cave experiment, one of the most famous and unsettling social psychology studies ever conducted. For decades, the lesson of Robbers Cave has been taught as a simple, chilling warning. It is the foundation of realistic conflict theory, the idea that if you put ordinary people into competition for limited resources, they will inevitably descend into tribalism, prejudice, and hatred. But the textbook story is missing a chapter, because what happened in that summer camp was not an organic collapse of human nature. It was a meticulously staged play, and when we look behind the curtain, we find a story that is far darker, far more complex, and ultimately far more revealing about the systems that govern our lives. The experiment began in the summer of 1954. The boys arrived on separate buses, completely unaware that another group existed. They were placed in 2 campsites, isolated by the dense hilly terrain of the park. For the first 5 to 6 days, the camp was a paradise. The boys hiked, swam, boated, and cooked meals together. In this isolation, something remarkable happened. Without any adult prompting, both groups rapidly and organically organized themselves. They established hierarchies, fell into specialized social roles, and negotiated group norms. One group named themselves the Eagles, cultivating an identity around toughness and resilience. The other named themselves the Rattlers, defining themselves through teamwork and coordination. They proudly stenciled these names onto flags and camp shirts. This was stage 1, in-group formation. It proved Muzafer Sharif's first hypothesis, that when strangers are brought together to achieve common goals, they will naturally construct a functioning, cohesive society. And at this point, there was no hatred. There was only pride, connection, and a deep sense of we-ness. But a storm was being manufactured. Toward the end of the first week, the researchers, who were masquerading as camp counselors, caretakers, and janitors, deliberately let the groups discover each other's existence. The reaction was immediate. Even before any formal competition had begun, an us and them language emerged. The boys demanded that the camp staff let them challenge the outsiders. They didn't know who the other boys were, but they knew they were the other. And that was exactly what the man pulling the strings was waiting for.
The mastermind of this study was Dr. Muzafer Sharif, a psychologist obsessed with understanding the roots of human conflict. To test his second hypothesis, that competition over scarce resources breeds prejudice, he introduced a zero-sum tournament. The Eagles and the Rattlers were thrust into a series of competitive games: baseball, tug-of-war, touch football, and cabin inspections. The stakes were intentionally made incredibly high. The winning group would receive a beautiful team trophy, individual medals, and highly coveted multi-bladed pocket knives. The losers would receive absolutely nothing. One side's joy required the other's absolute defeat. Almost overnight, the good-natured rivalry dissolved into venom. Stereotypes solidified. The Eagles labeled the Rattlers as dirty and cowardly. The Rattlers called the Eagles cheaters and sissies. Then, the psychological warfare turned physical. The Rattlers claimed the baseball pitch as their exclusive territory, planting their flag on the mound and warning the Eagles to stay off. In retaliation, the Eagles marched onto the field and burned the Rattlers' flag to ashes. The next day, the Rattlers launched a counter-raid. While the Eagles were away, the Rattlers ransacked their cabin, upturned their beds, and stole their private property, carrying it as war loot. The Eagles responded with their own cabin raids, food fights, and vandalism. The normal, well-adjusted boys of suburban America had been transformed into tribal factions. At this point, 93% of the boys' friendships were strictly confined within their own group. The outgroup was no longer just a rival team. They were the enemy. Sharif had successfully created a war in miniature. Now he had to see if he could stop it.
First, the researchers tried simple contact. They brought the Eagles and the Rattlers together to watch movies, eat meals, and celebrate holidays. But without a change in their relationship, contact only provided new opportunities for violence. Meals instantly devolved into food fights. Movie nights became shouting matches. Sharif realized that to end the war, he had to eliminate the zero-sum game. He had to introduce what he called superordinate goals, challenges so massive that neither group could solve them alone, but which both groups desperately needed to solve. One morning in the sweltering Oklahoma heat, the camp's water supply suddenly stopped flowing. The camp staff blamed it on vandals. In reality, the researchers had deliberately blocked the main valve north of the camp with a stuffed sack. Faced with a mutual crisis, the Eagles and the Rattlers set out as separate groups to inspect the extensive water lines. They met at the reservoir. There, 44 hands gathered around the blocked faucet. Suggestions and strategies were thrown out from both sides simultaneously. For 45 minutes, the boys worked side by side, clearing the obstruction together. When the water finally rushed through the pipes, there was common rejoicing. The Rattlers, seeing how thirsty the Eagles were, willingly stepped aside to let the Eagles drink first. There were no jeers, no insults. Over the next few days, the researchers introduced more cooperative crises. To secure a beloved movie that both groups wanted to watch, they had to pool their money, contributing $3.50 per group to pay the rental fee. When a truck carrying food for the entire camp accidentally became stuck in a deep rut, the boys retrieved the very same rope they had used to tear each other apart in the tug-of-war. But this time, they tied it to the truck. Together, they pulled. By the end of the camp, the tribal lines had dissolved. Seating arrangements at dinner were completely mixed. 2/3 of the boys' friendship choices now crossed group lines. When it was time to go home, they refused to take separate buses. They rode together, singing songs, having transformed from enemies back into children. The standard textbook reading of Robber's Cave is a neat, optimistic parable. It tells us that while competition breeds hatred, cooperation can save us. But this clean narrative ignores the most disturbing element of the entire study, the camp counselors. The boys believed they were in a natural world, reacting to natural events, but they weren't. The crises were manufactured, the scarcity was engineered, and more importantly, the hostility itself was actively coached. Historical analysis, notably by author Gina Perry, revealed that the researchers did not merely observe, they actively intervened. When the boys were slow to anger, the counselors egged them on. They practically handed the Eagles the matches to burn the Rattlers' flag. They structured the games so that frustration was guaranteed, and then pointed the boys toward the outgroup as the source of their pain. Even more revealingly, this wasn't Sharif's first attempt. In 1953, a year before Robber's Cave, Sharif ran a virtually identical experiment in Middle Grove, New York. But that study failed. Why? Because the boys refused to turn on each other. Despite the artificial competition, their friendships persisted, and eventually the boys realized that the adults were actively manipulating them to create a conflict. Instead of fighting each other, the boys united and turned their anger toward the researchers, forcing Sharif to shut the experiment down and quietly bury the data. In the failed 1953 study, and occasionally in 1954, the boys realized the truth. The real threat wasn't the other group of boys in the woods. The real threat was the third group, the powerful, invisible architects who were structuring their world to force a conflict. To understand why Muzaffar Sharif was so determined to prove this theory, we have to look at where he came from. Sharif was not just an academic in a sterile lab. Born Muzaffar Sharif Başoğlu in Turkey in 1905, his youth was shaped by absolute catastrophe. He lived through the violent collapse of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, and brutal ethnic conflicts. He witnessed the deportation of thousands of his neighbors and saw his own survival as a literal miracle. Later, in 1932, he traveled to Germany and watched Hitler's rise to power. When he returned to Turkey, his outspoken anti-fascist Marxist writings led to his arrest and imprisonment in 1944. He fled to America, only to find himself targeted by the FBI during the height of the McCarthyite witch hunts. Sharif had spent his entire life watching societies tear themselves apart, and he refused to accept the comfortable, conservative consensus of his era that humans are simply born with an instinctive, irrational urge to hate the other. Sharif believed that prejudice is not an inherent glitch in the human mind. He argued that if people are competitive, hostile, and selfish, it is because we have built a society based on private property and artificial scarcity that forces them to be. If you design a system where one group can only win if another group loses, you will get war. But if you change the system, if you create shared, superordinate goals, you can turn enemies into allies. As his wife and lifelong collaborator Carolyn Sharif wrote, they wanted to bring an optimistic, liberatory message that people can get along if the conditions are right.
We live in a world that often feels like a giant summer camp, engineered by invisible hands. Our politics, our economies, and our international relations are frequently structured as zero-sum games. We are told that resources are scarce, that jobs are disappearing, and that the other is coming to take what is ours. And just like the eagles and the rattlers, we quickly fall into our assigned roles. We paint our flags, we patrol our territories, and we burn the symbols of those across the creek. But the unwritten chapter of the Robbers Cave experiment offers a different path. The boys in 1953 in Middle Grove realized they were being manipulated, and they chose to look past the game. They realized that the real problem wasn't the children in the other cabin. It was the rules of the camp itself.
We are not mice trapped in Calhoun's closed universe, doomed to slide into a quiet extinction.
And we're not helpless children in a rigged experiment. We can look at the rules we've been given. We can look at the zero-sum games structured by those in power, and we can choose to rewrite them. Because conflict isn't our destiny. It's just the game we've been forced to play.